Alright, so today's video is all about PHP Data Objects, commonly referred to as PDO. Now, PDO was an improvement on MySQL which was MySQL improved, which was an enhancement to MySQL. So this is sort of the better way to run MySQL queries from your PHP code. And what I'm going to do today is just go through some of the basics, a few of the things like named parameters, the fetch method, the execute method, the prepare statement, a few other things like that, how to bind columns, so a bunch of stuff. But it should give you a good overall understanding of how this works, how PDO works with your PHP code and a MySQL database. So I'm running MAMP as my server right now, and I've got phpMyAdmin running as part of my configuration with MAMP. I've created a database called sample. Now, the tables and so on that I've got here are not important other than the fact that these are the column names and the table that I'm going to be referring to is users. Now, the data doesn't matter. You can set up whatever you want and just sort of change the column names in the queries that we're working with. So I'll leave this up here just for a second if you want to see those, but you'll see me refer to them in the code. I'm going to be just using user ID, username, email, first name, last name, just those first 5 columns. So we're going to be talking to this database right now. Inside of here, in this table, all I have are 2 rows. That's all I've got. I'm not going to be dealing with the passwords in this video. I'm just going to be working with these first 5 columns right here. Okay, so let's jump into PDO here. Oh, I've got a couple pages here. The links for this are inside the web page. If you want a copy of the code that I've dealt with here, the link is in the description to a code gist with all the code from today. So this is a list of all the PDO methods, the PDO class itself, and then the PDO statement class with all of its methods. So this list right here, here's the documentation, and this is all of the references that you need. So we're going to be talking about one of these, row count. You want to find out how many rows came back in the query that you just ran. Well, just as an example, you would come inside of here, and they will have examples inside of here. So you're going to take your prepared statement and call the row count method. Probably pretty small for you guys to see. You'll call the row count method, and it's going to give you back a number, an integer value for the number of rows that you got. Or so in your select statements, the number of rows returned, delete, insert, update, it's the number of rows that were affected by your query. Okay, so my web page right now, how it's running. Important message right here. I've connected, and yes, it has connected. It's allowed me to see the page, and I'm writing this out. I'm actually looping through here, through each one of the rows in this table right now. So there's 2 rows. I'm getting the word row written out twice. So let's look at that first. Step number 1, you always have to connect to the database. And because this is something that you will typically do on most of the pages in your website, it's a good idea to stick this into an include. I'm using require once because I don't want to accidentally connect multiple times. I only need to connect one time, so I'll say require once, and that way PHP knows if I've got includes inside of includes inside of includes, that's fine. It knows it only needs one copy of the DB include. Here's my connection to my local database. I try to call the new PDO method, and I have a video on this as well. That's why I'm rushing through this quite quickly. I connect. If it fails, I'm going to write out that there's an error message, and I'm going to exit from the page, meaning that I'm not going to get to the head and the body of my HTML file. And that's why we have this message appearing on the page. If you see this, the database connected. If there was a failure, I would never see this. So, what is writing out the word row twice? Well, if you have a very basic query like select star from users, just give me every row, every column, but I'm not asking for any parameters. There's no where filter. I'm not reducing the data in any way. I'm just saying, give me all the data. I haven't taken any variable and made it part of my query. And this is important. While I can put variables inside of here, come up with a SQL statement that I then use inside the query method, this variable right here, con, this is my connection. It's the variable that was created right here, con, and this is the one we'll be using throughout the page. So I've connected, and I'm calling the query method. I'm just taking my SQL statement, I'm passing it directly to the database and saying, run this. It's okay to use query here because I haven't put any variables into this. I haven't taken data from the user and said, all right, hey, give me your first name. I'm going to use that as a filter. You never want to trust the users and just blindly send whatever they give you to the database. Bad, bad, bad move. Do not do that for security reasons. You don't want to give them a chance to do a SQL injection attack and get into your database. So, if and only if there is no variable, no data coming from the user, then you can use query. And then we use the fetch method. So this query returns our record set object, and I can call fetch on that. Inside of a while loop, this method returns one row from my record set. I'm putting it into a variable called row, and I'm just doing a while loop. When record set fetch no longer returns anything, the while loop stops. So we're going to use this approach with our other code as we get down the page here a little bit as well. We're going to do the same thing as we did here. For this first one, I'm just writing out the word row twice. Okay, now getting into something a little bit more practical with PDO. One of the reasons that they came up with it was, well, why leave it to the developer to always be filtering and sanitizing the data that comes from the user? So the user gave me this data. Okay, well, I've got to make sure that they weren't trying to do something nefarious with that text that they sent me. So why not make that into something that the PDO class handles for you? And that's what we're going to do here. So in our second version, select star from users where username equals question mark. Every time I put a question mark inside of there, I can now call the prepare method, and PDO is going to understand that this means I'm going to pass it a value. So it's ready to sanitize the information for me. So let's do this. We'll say prepared. I'll just use that as my variable name. The prepared statement is going to be my connection, and I'm going to call the prepare method. And what I put inside there is my SQL string. That's this string right here, the one with the question mark. And it will recognize every place that I put a question mark. It doesn't have to be just one. I can have 60 of them in there if I want. It is now ready to accept an array of values. So for each one of these question marks in order, I need to provide a value. And it understands that it needs to be careful with that. So if there's special characters, it needs to escape them before making it part of the statement. I will now execute the statement. So we take prepared and we call the execute method. Inside of here, this is where we have to pass in the array of values that are going to be put into the question marks. I want to use this. This could come from anywhere. Could have come from a user form. Doesn't matter where it came from. It was in a variable that I'm going to use here. So inside of my execute, I need to pass in an array. The first thing in the array is username. There we go. That is actually the thing that's going to run the query. It's going to take my array of values, it's going to put them into my prepared statement, and then it's going to execute that. So I now have inside of this object right here, prepared, inside of that, this is going to be my record set. We can now do things like, hey, let's check for the number of rows that came back. If we got some, great. If not, then we'll write something else on the screen. So we can do this with the one that I showed inside of the PHP website right here, php.net. This is what we're doing right here. We're doing the row count to find out how many rows came back. So if prepared row count is greater than 0, I am now going to work with that. Otherwise, oops, should be the other way. Otherwise, I'm going to write out a message about there being no records. And actually, this is no variable inside here. It's just all one string. Something like that. So right now, we're going to have an empty table inside of here. If we inspect the page, go inside of head, there's the row, and table. This is an empty table that's being generated. So this happened. If I change this to something that does not exist, there is no username that matches that. Now, when I reload this page, now we get this message. Instead of the table, it comes back with that paragraph. No users found the match for your value. Okay, so we'll put this back to Steve so we can actually look at the values coming back. Now, with the prepared statement, the value that comes back, there's 3 different ways that we can output this. We can say, I want it as a numeric array, so I can just refer to whatever columns I have here numerically, column 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. I can say I want it as an associative array, and this honestly is the only one that I've ever used. I've never wanted it numerically. I've never, or there's been a handful of times, very rare though. Fetch both gives you numerically and the associative array. The associative array is the one that you're going to use most of the time because you're going to know the names of your columns, and that's how we're going to access these things. So inside of my table, I want to loop through the arrays. I'm going to do the same thing that I did up here. I'm just going to paste this in. We'll fix it in just a moment. So row, and instead of record set, this is prepared. All right. This is going to loop through, getting us one row at a time. And for each one of the rows, we can write out whatever we want. I'm going to put the TDs with row. That's the variable that I get here. And because I said associative, it means I can use whatever the column names were, the field names. So let's say user ID, username, first name, last name, whatever you want to put, whichever columns you want to use. So we're going to write out one row in our table for each one of these. If you wanted to put a row of headers, you would put that up here outside the loop before the loop begins. There we go. Here is the one row that matched the value that we put in here. So there was only one match, so our table only has one row. And there we have it. Okay, so that's basic PDO, doing the matching using the prepare and execute, passing in the array of values. Another way that we can do this, instead of just with the question marks, we can repeat this whole thing except with named parameters. So down here, the second example using name parameters, here's my SQL statement. And instead of saying question mark and question mark, I've actually created it's like variables to represent them. So UN and EM, these are going to be the variable names. So I don't have to know what the exact sequence was. I can provide them in any order. I don't have to give it in the same order that I've put them in my SQL statement. We're going to do the same thing that we did up above here. I'm just going to copy these lines. So paste them in here. And let's call this named instead of prepared, just so we've got a different variable name for each one. I'm going to pass in here an array, same as before, but instead of just saying, here's value 0, here's value 1, here's value 2, I'm going to use an associative array, and I'm going to say, hey, the value for UN is, I can put the string here, or I can put my variable name, user, and then something else that's going to be inside this array. There's something that's going to be called EM, and its value will be my variable EM from right here. Now, because I'm using like, here's my wildcard, just like this. I don't have to escape it here. I'm passing it in, and because it's a prepared statement, this is going to take whatever value I provide, and it's going to handle any escaping that's required. Or this is a wildcard character, so I'm going to take it and use it like a wildcard character. For username, it's equal, so it's just a string. Now there is no match for Bob in here, so I'm just going to match everything. I'm going to match everything that has @gmail.com as the end of the email address. And then all the stuff that we do down here is going to be the same as we did up above, so I'm just going to take a second and copy and paste all that down. Okay, so we're doing the same thing, but this is going to be called named instead of prepared. There we go. So same idea. We've just provided names. So if I wanted to change the order in here, that's okay. It does not have to be in the same order as it was in here. I don't have to UN first and then EM. With the question marks, I would have had to do that. Oh, no, these are found from matched for that. Oh, and that's because right here, I'm using the old SQL statement instead of this one. So we want this SQL statement to be the one we prepare. There we go. Oh, I've got a typo in here as well, I think. And oh, I've got email. There we go. There we go. So we're getting both of these rows, which is all the data inside there. It's everything that ended with @gmail.com. Okay, so we have named parameters. We've got a basic prepared statement using the question mark. And one last thing I want to show you is how to bind columns. So I'm just going to do it as part of this right here. Inside, instead of doing this, the associative, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my named object and call the bind column method. I'm going to say the first column that comes back, which is user ID. So here's my 4 columns that I've retrieved. The first one, I'm going to put it into a variable called ID. My second column, third, fourth column, I'll say this is E, and this is F, and this is L. So these are now variables that I can use inside of here. So instead of having to write out all these things, so if I duplicate each one of these lines, and I will comment out every second one to see you've got the original value in the source code in that code gist, I can now use these variables instead of having to write out the array. It just means a little bit of work up front means it's easier to write them out afterwards. But it's doing the same thing. There we go. Now if I run this, we get the exact same result. It's just a different way of writing it out. So if you have a lot of columns that you're working with, it may be beneficial to do this. You can also use bind column when you're putting the values in. So it's another way of doing this. I prefer the named parameters. It's a little bit easier to track if you're using the named ones. You can match up all the variable names. Bind column, you're going back to using the numbers. But whatever your personal preference, you can do it with bind column as well. It is another way of doing it. All right, so I hope that gives you a good introduction to how PDO works. I will be doing a couple more videos on PDO. I already have the one on how to create the connection. That's linked to down in the description as well. This is the first basic introduction to writing queries with PDO, and I'm going to do a couple more in the next week or so. All right, so hope that helps you out. If you have any questions about that, feel free to leave those in the comments. And as always, thanks for watching.